I invite you to join our discussion and take action to build your confidence as a leader. Become a real change agent and help drive our future.
Confidence means several things, I would say.
Trust and a firm belief in yourself.
Being able to have a voice and knowing when to use your voice.
Knowing who you are, where you come from, what you can do to make a difference, and also not afraid of being different.
I'm not a naturally confident person. And what I've learned to do is to be willing to step forward despite that.
Self-confidence is so important in business because we can't forget that we're the experts.
The cost of people not feeling confident enough to step forward or waiting until they're perfect is that very many contributions get left behind.
You are the expert when you walk into that room, and so you have to portray that. And of course, back it up with really knowing what you're talking about.
In a world where the pace of change is significant, you cannot do what you did last year if you really want to evolve and develop and continue to grow.
I've noticed colleagues who've actually been less willing to take risks on, and sometimes I think they're being held back because of what they think their family wants or what they think others want, rather than them saying, look, I can do it.
The truth is, without taking risks, you just simply don't advance at a rapid pace. You will move forward in your career, no doubt, without taking risks. But when you take those risks, the jump is an accelerated jump. It's a big jump.
One difference I realize between women and men is that women prefer to being asked for something. Women prefer to be discovered, merited for their performance and for their work, whilst men are used to fight for something. And I think, women should take up that fight as well.
Knowing yourself is so important. Knowing what you want, knowing what you don't want, knowing what is important for you, that helps you be confident.
I would actually say to college students to actually be themselves. You know, express your ideas. People actually want to work with people who are open and have a lot of ideas.
Well, I think when you are a college graduate, your confidence is not afraid that I don't know things and have a courage to asking questions, thoughtful questions, and seeking for help.
If you have a passion, if you have an ambition in terms of what it is you want to achieve, step forward and look for opportunities, look for people, look for resources that will enable you to learn so that you can make the contribution that you want to make and grow as a professional.
What would you do if you weren't afraid? It's a powerful question. It goes to the heart of our ability to achieve our potential as individuals. And today we're going to explore this issue of confidence in our ability to achieve our potential. How do we build our confidence? I'm Mike Fenlon. I serve as the Global Talent Leader for PwC, and on behalf of all of my partners and colleagues across our global network, I want to welcome you to Aspire to Lead. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into this question. What would you do if you weren't afraid? And as much as this series is dedicated to women in leadership development, we know that we have a very diverse audience today. We have thousands of students across the world joining us. I think the earliest breakfast parties are going on right now in San Jose and along that west coast. We have late night groups gathering throughout Asia. We believe we'll have individuals in almost 100 countries joining us in this webcast over time. So thank you. And we also have many clients, senior executives. In part because this question of confidence is relevant, of course, for all of us. And before we get into our panel, I want to make this question very real, very personal. So let's start and consider this issue of confidence and our potential. And I'm going to ask everyone right now, everyone listening, I'm going to ask you to think about one person in your life who has not achieved his or her potential. It might be a family member, a relative, it might be a neighbor, a friend, a colleague, someone you've known over the course of your life that you can think of right now and you can see them, who has not fulfilled their potential because of a lack of confidence. And that lack of confidence has prevented them from overcoming obstacles, whether those are external obstacles or internal. And as we speak to thousands of students around the world right now, what an exciting time of life. No doubt you're looking towards the future with some excitement. Perhaps as well, though, with some anxiety, maybe even some fear. Will I be able to achieve my potential? Do I have the confidence to overcome barriers, to overcome challenges, anxieties? It's a powerful question, and it's a very real one. Now, I actually want to anchor our discussion in an equally real story, and it's a story of confidence. And it starts in Mongolia, in a place far away, a young girl being raised by a single mom and living in a nomadic village for the first 10 years of her life. Her mother is desperate that her daughter obtain opportunities she's never had. Ultimately, they moved to Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia. And then they take even a bigger risk, and they move to the United States. Now, when they move to Denver, they don't know anyone. They only have a distant relative they've never met before, and they don't speak a word of English. Imagine that, moving to another country. It's just you and your mom. You don't speak English. You're starting a new life, filled with hope, but also fear and anxiety. Well, that individual is here with us today, Chemka Taschecker. And that picture you may be seeing right now is Chemka as a young woman in school. This morning over breakfast, we were talking about her very first day in school in the States, what that was like to walk down the hallway. And she still remembers it to this day, very clearly, of course, and the fear that had been building up for months about this first day at school. It meant she would have to work harder. It meant she'd have to put in longer hours. It would be hard to connect with others. But over time, she did connect. She built friendships, and she started to get good grades. That led to the graduation, and then ultimately the University of Denver. Chemka won our Aspire to Lead video contest, and we've flown Chemka and her mother here to join us here in New York, and in London, I should say. Sorry. And I'd like to introduce Chemka and her mom. If you would both please stand for a moment, we can recognize you. We're delighted you're here, and we'll hear from Chemka a little bit later during our session, our broadcast. So let's begin, and I want to just do some brief introductions. To my left, Eileen Naughton, distinguished executive with an extraordinary career. Currently, Eileen leads Google UK and Ireland, and previously has held senior executive roles at Google, and before that was president of the Time magazine and Time group of publications. So we're thrilled and delighted that you're joining us today, Eileen.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Katty Kay, distinguished journalist, anchor of BBC America, has covered Washington, D.C., scandals, elections, and has reported from, I think, every continent in the world except maybe Antarctica, I'm not sure.
I'll get there.
Yeah, you'll get there. And Claire Shipman, a similarly distinguished journalist, national contributor. Claire, by the way, earlier in her career, worked for CNN, covered the collapse of the Soviet Union. I believe you actually saw Boris Yeltsin in a tank. Is that right?
Yes,
in
I
Red
did.
Square?
Yes, I did.
And has covered the White House and other and other very distinguished reporting. So we've got a fantastic panel here. Again, let's start in a very personal place. And maybe if each of you could share a time in your own life when you felt like you didn't have confidence, you lacked confidence, and how you dealt with that. And maybe contrast that with a time when you did have confidence. And what led to that? What can we learn from that contrast?
Well, it's interesting, Mike. I was thinking a lot about this, and Katty and I wrote a book on confidence, and it was really through that project that I started to understand that I have lacked a lot of confidence in my career, but I didn't always recognize it as such. I'm a real perfectionist, a little obsessive, and I would appear on a lot of political panels, for example, when I was covering politics. And I would appear on these panels, and I was always very determined to get everything right all the time. I would study. Sometimes my husband and I were on these panels together. He didn't prepare at all, right? I was preparing, I was working, I was taking notes, I was anticipating. And then I would appear on the panel, and of course I would stick to the question that was asked, right? I would listen. I was always the only woman on the panel. I was the one, there were other men. I would listen to the men sort of ramble on, go off on other tangents, and I was always very focused on keeping to time, making sure I was doing it right, sticking to the answer. And I always thought I had done pretty well. As we worked on this book and I started to think more about risk-taking as part of confidence, I realized, I think I talked a lot less than the men on those panels, but I'm not sure. I went back and I took a year's worth of panels and I measured. I had talked 30% less than the men on the panels. So what I had viewed as something I had done very well, check the box, I actually think in retrospect I didn't do well at all. And I contrast that with a big failure that I had a couple of years ago, which was I wanted to try to speak without notes. I'm a bit of an introvert, and and perfectionist, and I always thought, when I speak in public, I want to have everything written out, I want to be precise. And I gave a fairly disastrous speech at one point because I thought, I'm just going to try it, I bet I can do it. It was really not, it did not go over that well. And eventually I learned, though, what I needed to speak without notes, that I needed a little bit of notes, and it was that failure, in fact, that I came to realize was a reflection of confidence, my willingness to do something that was really terrifying to me, and it actually helped me grow. So I've started to look at confidence in a new context. It's not, as I heard one of your speakers say, necessarily about success or getting something perfectly right. It's about taking a risk.
Thank you.
You know, Mike, it's so interesting. I mean, listening to those voices from around the world, we had Rwanda, we had Germany, we had France, we had China represented on that opening video. And actually, a lot of the women were saying the same thing. Take a risk, be prepared to fail, do things that are hard for you because that's how you grow your confidence. For me, I'm going to tell a very concrete example. A while ago, I was invited into the White House to a meeting on the Middle East. And I turned up at this meeting and I walk in, and a bit like Claire, it's 14 men and 2 women. And they all speak Arabic and Farsi, and they know Middle East politics. And I walk in and I immediately feel like a fraud. I'm in the wrong place. I'm a generalist. I don't deserve to be here. So I'm listening to the presentation from the National Security Council staff of the White House, and it's a very intelligent discussion, and it comes to the period of question and answer. And the men in the group, actually, you know what, they don't even raise their hands. They just jump in with questions. And I sit there and I think to myself, there cannot be 2 women in this room and we don't ask a question. So I think I'm going to ask a question. It's not my speciality, but I will ask about the Middle East. And then I start thinking, but you know what, if I do, everyone will look at me and they'll realize I don't know what I'm talking about. And then I'll probably blush, because I tend to blush. And I might sweat a bit, and then I'll probably stumble. And all of this is going through my head, and it probably would have been more useful to listen to the discussion, frankly, rather than get obsessed with my own thoughts. But eventually, I almost had to force myself to put my hand in the air and get the question out. And it wasn't the most intelligent question in the history of questions, but it wasn't the most stupid either. And the sky didn't fall on my head, and the earth didn't open up and swallow me whole. And I think what happened in the growth of confidence for me was that the next time I was in a very similar situation, I knew I had done it before. And I had banked in the course of that excruciating hour in the White House, where I felt I didn't deserve to be there and I felt I didn't belong. I had gone through something that was very difficult for me personally. It sounds ridiculous, right, that should be so hard for me. But in that setting, it challenged my confidence. And I did it, and I survived, and I succeeded enough. And the next time around, it was much easier, and I could do it without that fear and trepidation. And that was expanding my confidence.
Thank you.
So I have a thematically not dissimilar observation, and we have not rehearsed this, but I was working after university, and I noticed the good jobs were going to the young men with MBAs. And I decided to go off to business school. And I was a reasonably good writer. I had worked as a journalist before going to business school. And so I was very often selected to be on the work teams with the engineering guys who needed a good writer. And we worked all night on this presentation, and then it was due the next day to be presented in stand-up format. And because I was writing it, I wasn't rehearsing. And I got up there, and I was in a cold sweat, and my voice was shaking, and I'd written the damn paper. And the guys were swimming through it because they'd had time to rehearse, and I thought, never again. That's never going to happen to me again. I will always take the time to prepare. And it was one of those signal events where I didn't realize, I mean, one of the greatest fears people have is fear of public speaking for some strange reason. And I've gotten over it. I got over it in a very big way. Several years later, working at Time Warner, we were hosting the first ever webcast of the company quarterly business meeting. And the chairman of Time Warner and others were there. And I happened to be tagged to be a speaker. I was working on a strategic project. It was an update. And the day before, I'd had an unexpected long afternoon in a doctor's office with my then 15-month-old son, who received a very difficult genetic diagnosis. And I learned he would be disabled for the rest of his life. And I had to go back to the office. In those days, this was before PowerPoint, and finish making my slides. And this was one time where I really didn't have that afternoon to prepare. I was not as prepared as I'd taught myself to be for public speaking. But when you get the worst kind of diagnosis that as a parent, you would ever fear getting, everything else pales in comparison. And all those silly little petty fears melted away. And I went up on that stage the next day reasonably prepared, and I nailed it. Because a much more serious matter had replaced the fear of speaking. And that was, the worst fear I had was realize something dreadfully wrong with my child's health. And flash forward, he's 22, he's learning to be a master farmer, he's handsome, 6'4", he's wonderful. But he's also quite disabled, and he won't live independently. So I overcame that fear and other fears that I didn't even probably recognize because of that signal event.
Thank you. And I want to thank each of you for those powerful, very personal examples. And I think for each of us as well, they start to offer some insight into how each one of us can build our confidence. And by the way, we've got a special request for men to be engaged in this dialogue. We'll come to that in a little bit later across the webcast around the role of men in this conversation around gender and leadership. But maybe we could talk a little bit about the Confidence Code. It's a fantastic book. If you have not picked it up, I'd urge you to do that, to read the book. Katty and Claire, maybe you could share with us some of the insights. What is your advice for overcoming these internal obstacles, external obstacles, for all of us?
Sure. I mean, for a start, maybe why we wrote this book, The Confidence Code. Claire and I had worked a lot with women in senior positions, looking at the value of women in the workforce. And we all know now there are half a dozen global studies that show that organizations that employ more women at senior levels are doing better than their competitors. So we would interview these incredibly senior women in business, in politics, in the military, in sports, and even in journalism. And we kept hearing the same thing from women along the lines of, I'm just lucky to be where I am, or I was in the right place at the right time, or I've been offered this promotion, but I actually don't think I'm ready for it yet. And it occurred to us, we never heard men say things like this. And we started to wonder, was this just anecdotal, or was there actually a gap in confidence between men and women? And we started looking into the research. We interviewed dozens of psychologists and neurologists and business people, and we found there's actually a pretty compelling case that when it comes to their work lives, not their personal lives, women are less confident than men.
We were surprised to find hard data on this, and a lot of it's corporate data, corporations that have surveyed their employees, and they find, for example, that women will apply for a promotion when we feel we have roughly 100% of the qualifications for a job. Men will do the same at about 60%. There's academic data where they measure performance on tests and what men and women think of their performance. Although they'll score about the same on these tests, women routinely underestimate how they've performed, men overestimate how they've performed. And so we saw so much data that really boiled down to the fact that women tend to underestimate their abilities. And we saw it again and again. And we also did a deep dive then into the science of confidence, right? Where does it come from? Why is there this gap? And I think we were surprised to find that part of confidence is genetic. We didn't think we would discover that.
Claire and I tested our own genes, which may have been a rather foolish thing to do, to see if we had the genes that would predispose us to confidence. And we found we don't. When it comes to our genetic predisposition, we are pretty much basket cases. So then we realized that actually, although there is some genetic predisposition to feeling more confident in life, about somewhere between 25 and 50%, the rest of it is a choice. And women can make choices, all of us can make choices every day in our lives to expand our confidence. And I think it's worth looking at a couple of the reasons why women are less confident than men.
Well, it's interesting because we found that the genetics really isn't a factor because we didn't find a big gender difference in terms of the genetics. But what we did find is that, first of all, and this won't surprise anybody here, but the fact that there's an uneven playing field is a big reason. I mean, there's so much data on stereotype threat and the fact that when you are in a minority, you go into the office, whatever you're doing, you don't feel as confident, you don't perform as well. And so that affects our confidence. We also found very interestingly though, and this is so important for young women to understand because we kept saying, young women are doing so well academically. What's going on? What's happening in this transition from academia to work? Carol Dweck, who wrote Mindset, who's just brilliant, said to us, look, if life were one long grade school, women would rule the world. Life is not one long grade school, and the rules change dramatically. So young women grow up, we're so much more able to be perfect. We're so much more able to please people. Our EQ is a little bit higher, and we grow up pretty quickly internalizing that as something for which we're valuable. We need to please people, we need to get everything right on the spelling test, and by the time we're in high school, many of us are full-blown perfectionists. Men, on the other hand, learn to screw up pretty early, and they learn that it's okay because they're doing it, and they see that they grow up more accustomed to risk-taking. And so what we came to find in terms of what we can do about confidence is, a lot of it is about this perfectionism and a willingness to look at failure, to take risks, and that's something that we see that a lot of young women and older women are still lacking.
So there's a kind of action side of confidence. We came up with a great definition for confidence, which is confidence is the stuff that turns thoughts into action. You need confidence to take action, but you also get more confidence when you take action. So when you go outside your comfort zone, when you try things that are difficult, when you challenge yourself, that, as we have done at stages, that's when you grow your confidence. The other flip side of this, I think, for women that is worth mentioning before we get on to specific steps, is that women tend to think and think and think and sometimes overthink things. We have a tendency, much more than men do, to what psychologists call ruminate. The smallest criticism that we get, something goes wrong, a friend doesn't return our call, a boss doesn't answer our email, we start internalizing that and worrying about, we are like a dog with a bone, we don't let it go. We're worrying and worrying and worrying. And if you are doing that, combined with holding yourself to a very perfect standard and being concerned about taking risks and failure, all of it combined seems to limit women's confidence.
So when we talk about an action plan in our book, and I think we have a slide that shows some of the tips we have, the number one thing we talk about is get comfortable with failure. Here we say this is our challenge to all of you listening today, which is make risk-taking part of your daily diet. You heard every woman in the PwC video talk about taking risks. And I think, look, for all of us, risks will seem different. For some of us, it's risky to speak in public. For others, it's risky to turn in something that isn't perfect. And for some people, we talked to a friend of ours who finds just making decisions risky business and a real fear of just deciding. And so I think you've got to figure out what it is that is hard for you and frightens you and start very small. Because the key is, if you're not willing to fail, and if indeed you're not doing some failing, you're probably not growing, and you're certainly not succeeding in a way that will be meaningful in the workplace.
And the second tip we came across, the really big thing, was to do with this other component and thinking and overthinking, making rewiring a routine part of your life. So take an example where you've emailed somebody at work. They haven't replied. You start thinking, oh my goodness, they think I have done something terribly wrong. It must be all my fault. They're all mad at me, which I have to say is something that Claire and I are very prone to doing. And assuming that this is about us. And the reality is that probably something else is going wrong. And you can rewire the way you think about things. It was actually a neuroscientist that came up with this for us, and it was such a brilliant piece of advice, that when you get into one of those cycles that are very confidence damaging, of thinking that you have done something wrong and you shouldn't be there and somebody's mad at you and you're a fraud, come up with an alternative scenario. Come up with an alternative explanation for why they haven't emailed you back. They haven't emailed me back because they're busy, they're traveling, they don't email in the evenings, they usually email in the mornings. That process of giving your brain an alternative scenario can actually eventually rewire the way you think.
I mean, the data on, the science on brain plasticity is so exciting, and they're learning more minute by minute, but they can see now that these basic cognitive behavioral therapy techniques changes the way our brain works. So don't underestimate your ability to rewire your brain. We also say tap into your authentic strengths. This was something that was really exciting for us to discover, which is that confidence really will not look the same for everybody. I think we all have a very stereotypical idea of what confidence is, and often it's that Mad Men style confidence. It's bravado, it's swagger, it's the person who talks first or talks the loudest or dominates a meeting. And what we came to realize, actually with the help of Christine Lagarde, who was an enormous help for our book, the first female head of the IMF, she said, look, we cannot, as women, risk losing what we do very well simply to behave in a way that men may behave more naturally. And that's when we started to realize, oh, actually, that way of behaving may be, in fact, a way of behaving. It may not be confidence. That there is a quiet confidence. We had a lot of fascinating conversations about confident listening, analysis, different ways of contributing that still mean your voice will be heard, but thinking about what is authentic to you and not wearing somebody else's armor is critical.
Yeah, because then it's impossible really to be confident. And I think for women it's very important that we have a sense of what passing confidence on looks like too, not just to our colleagues and our friends, but to our daughters as well. Women are very, very good at being great friends. We're great at telling each other, you're wonderful, you're perfect, everything's going to be fine, you're just great as you are, they don't recognize you. We're less good at saying, take a risk. Just get out there and do it. Take a nudge, take a chance. Stop sitting there and worrying about it, now get on and do it. And I think actually that's probably the most useful thing that we can do to our colleagues to pass it on.
And actually, the more you focus on somebody else's confidence, the more confident you feel. So there is a side benefit to that. And then do it afraid. It's funny because I came across this at a conference Katty and I were attending, and a lot of people ask us, well, what about fake it till you make it? Does that make sense? And we have said in our book, no, especially for women, because we are already so prone to feeling like frauds that consciously going into something, faking it, doesn't make sense. Nonetheless, to start the cycle of confidence and to taking action and failing and risk-taking, you sometimes need a jump start, and I think that's what the fake it till you make it was used for. And what we mean by do it afraid is acknowledge that you're in a situation that is frightening to you. It makes sense often that you're in a situation, as Katty was, and the only woman in a room full of men, or starting a new job. Acknowledge that is normal, and then make a decision to do it anyway. A lot of times we've had men say to us, but we feel we don't feel confident all the time either. And one of the key differences we've found between men and women is that men will often use that fear as an impetus for action. Women often use the fear to hesitate. So do it afraid, know you're afraid, and do it anyway. That's just a great challenge to all of you today.
Thank you. And again, I want to remind everyone, one of our goals here today in Aspire to Lead is that we all leave with a specific action that we can apply in our own lives. We've talked a lot about confidence being a very powerful determinant in our lives and our ability to fulfill our potential. So as we go through the webcast, think about this. You've both just shared 5 specific actions. What's the one action that I could take and commit myself to? And after we finish the webcast, have a discussion with someone. Perhaps you're in a group today, perhaps you're by yourself. But identify that action and share it with others, and there's enormous power and energy in doing that. So with that, Eileen, I know Google, like PwC, is very focused on diversity and inclusion. And perhaps you want to share some observations from your own really extraordinary career experience, as well as from what you're learning at Google.
I'd be happy to. So Google is a large tech company. It is pretty much an innovation company, but technology is at the core of Google. And I showed up there almost 9 years ago from a background in journalism, and I was on the business side of journalism for many years at Time Inc. and the magazine company. So I, like just about everyone who shows up at Google, suffered a little bit in the beginning from imposter syndrome. It's one of the metrics we actually measure across engineers, product managers, marketing people, professionals. It's a very high performance culture. We hire mostly A students and A+ students, in fact. And so anyone getting there at first is a little bit intimidated by the cohort. So just like anyone else, I didn't know how to code. I showed up, I was in general management and business leadership. And I went on one of these leadership programs where I was paired off for an expedition. I had a map, or I was in a group that had a map and a sat nav. This is before your phone could act as a device that could help get you through the woods. And we had 5 treasures to find. So of course the guys took the equipment. They took the map, and they took the sat nav. And they were engineers. I was like, okay, they must know what they're doing. And I'm going along, and I kind of was looking at the map over this guy's shoulder. And they're moving along. They gave up on looking for the first thing. I said, wait a minute, there it is. It was way up in a tree. I used my eyes. And then we went to the next target zone, and they were in there walking around. And I just thought, well, if I were hiding something, I would hide it there. And I found the second thing. And then I found the third thing. And all of a sudden, I was the most popular girl on the team. And I realized I'm not an imposter. I have eyes. They work. I have intuition. I have experience. And from that point forward, I no longer suffered. And that was probably within 6 months of joining Google. I no longer suffer from imposter syndrome. And I think it's a tendency in any new environment where we kind of think maybe I'm not quite worthy to be in this cohort. So I would encourage anyone who's listening to be courageous and believe in the experience and the strengths and the skills you naturally have and assert them. And don't give control over to a presumptively more gifted, more technical, or more expert person. So that's a personal story. But inside Google, we do work extensively now on raising the confidence and participation of women in the workforce. Like any tech company, Google has low numbers of females relative to the population. So we, in June of last year, published our diversity statistics. We have about 30% females globally. And it's particularly low in the engineering side of the business. As you might imagine, in human resources and legal, there's a higher representation of women. And so there have been a number of programs we've launched. One has been an unconscious bias training where all employees have been invited, and more than half have completed this training around just understanding the unconscious biases each one of us carries, male and female. We have bias about educational background, we have bias about skin color, we have bias about country of origin that is not necessarily intended or even something one is self-aware of, but they exist. And when you start understanding that everyone may have influence that is kind of subcutaneous, you behave a little differently, you're a little more sensitized, and I think that alone has been a great progression. We insist on, in every interview panel for a new employee, there have to be women considered. And it's harder in the technical fields to find qualified engineering talent, but we have a very, very strict and measured mandate to do so. We score ourselves on how well we do against this. And then we have programs specifically for women and women in their younger years of management. And one program is called the Stretch Program, teaching them confidence, the ability to negotiate, to stand and speak spontaneously, to assert and defend a position without a whole lot of preparation and format. And just getting them more comfortable being assertive, because as Katty and Claire have indicated, all the data suggests women are more retiring and more withholding and more ruminative. And we're trying to break that cycle a bit.
Great, thank you. Why don't we then talk a bit about men?
I love men.
Yeah. We do love men.
I do. I'm married to one.
You have a son. So let's talk a bit about men here, because it's interesting. As I've read the books, I've attended meetings. We Aspire to Lead. Last year we did Aspire with Sheryl Sandberg and Rachel Thomas of Lean In. Fabulous session. But I started to feel a certain weight or pit in my stomach, because what I observed was women talking to women, which was great. Lean In circles were forming. That's how I got your book, by the way. One of my colleagues gave me your book, who was their Lean In Circle, read Confidence Code. But women were leaving these meetings and discussions with long lists of to-dos. In some instances, to be a bit more like men, right? Leaning in, being more assertive. But what were the discussions men were having? And what were the actions for men? What's the place for men in this dialogue? I think these are very important questions. And today, actually, we wanted to explore that question as well. And we have some actions and some ideas to share, and I'd love for any of you to share your own reactions. PwC, by the way, recently announced, our global chairman, Dennis Nally, recently announced at the Davos World Economic Forum that we're serving as a global impact partner with the United Nations initiative, He for She. In fact, that's the symbol I happen to be wearing on my lapel, for He for She. And we're going to ask all the men today, are you He for She? But let's talk about what that means in substance and some specific ideas. So the first idea is to start by listening. So engage the women in your life, your colleagues, maybe fellow students. Ask questions and listen. How is their experience different from your own? Work hard to empathize and to put yourself in their shoes. We also want you to look at your network. We know, and this is true for all of us, regardless of gender, we tend to build networks that are very similar to ourselves. We know there's enormous power, research has proven this, for your career in having a broad, diverse network. So for our men who are part of our dialogue today, what's the diversity of your network look like? Is it just like you? What can you do to increase women as individuals you're connected with as part of your personal network? How can you have more women in your network? So assess your network and diversify it. Blind spots. Eileen, you mentioned the work you've done at Google on blind spots. We've done similar work at PwC, working with professors like Mahzarin Banaji at Harvard and her extraordinary work. In fact, you'll see the URL, and I would urge you to go there if you want to experience your own blind spots. You don't need to take our word for it that we all have blind spots or implicit biases. That's part of the human condition. But the point is to recognize them and then to do something about them. Understanding it's not acceptable to simply box others in based on stereotypes or automatic thoughts and beliefs I have that shape, of course, our behavior. So as men, it's a great opportunity for us to build our self-awareness. Standing up for inclusion, what does that mean? Well, we all, whether we're a student or an executive, we spend a good part of our lives, or journalists, in groups, team meetings, and sort of waking up and paying attention. Who's speaking, who isn't? Who's being heard, who isn't? And standing up and really making sure that everyone's voice is heard. Being inclusive. And we know in the world we're in today, there's never been a greater premium in getting the best ideas, enabling everyone to contribute to their full potential. And by the way, there's lots of research that has shown that groups that include women outperform groups that don't have that kind of gender diversity, groups just with men. Startups led by women, there's evidence that they outperform. Boards that have women on them, those companies outperform. There's research related to revenue, market share, client satisfaction, you name it. So this also goes to bottom line results and performance. So the point is, as men, let's stand up and be advocates for inclusion. Let's make our voices heard. And one way you can do that right now on your phone is go to heforshe.org. Make a public commitment, and then follow it up with some of the actions we've talked about. And men, let's start talking to each other. It's not enough for women to be convening. Let's start talking to each other, and then ultimately leaning in together with women to create an inclusive environment, whether that's in our universities or in our workplaces. And I don't know if any of you have observations or reactions around some of these gender dynamics and differences.
You know, Mike, it's so interesting when we brought out the book, and obviously we were often speaking to female audiences, and we suddenly started to notice two things. One is that the impact we could have with organizations was much bigger when we had men in the room. When we could include men in this conversation and make them feel part of it and make them realize that this was not really a gender issue. This is an issue of improving organizations for everybody.
Yes.
We have better organizations when we have diversity at the top. We just do, and the evidence is incontrovertible. But one of the things we found when the book came out was we would have men come to us and say, wow, I see this in my wife and I see this in my daughter. I just didn't understand it. And that gets to your point number one, ask questions and listen.
Yes.
I remember Claire and I did an event with a big global corporation, hospitality corporation, and a male executive at the end of the session was asked to give his thoughts on it, and he stood up and he said, you know what? I've had 2 women recently in my division who I've suggested should go for a promotion, and they both told me they weren't ready. But I didn't realize that this was a phenomenon, that something bigger was going on than just these 2 women happening to say that they weren't ready. And I think this process of helping men understand, and men wanting to understand, they know because they see it in their partners and they see it in their own daughters. The number of dads who have come to us and said, I have my daughter and she's so smart and she's graduating from college and I see her hold herself back.
And I think it can be a tough subject for men because men can feel defensive that progress hasn't been made. There are a lot of firms that have been trying for a lot of years to make progress, and I think sometimes there's a sense of what are we doing wrong? They also can view it as it's a touchy subject. Do you really want to talk about female confidence, and is that an accusation? And so I think it really is when you can have conversations that are inclusive and really do educate. I mean, we had another gentleman, different firm, an investment bank, at one point say to us, I realized we had an issue when I would see that we could give the same 360 review to a man and a woman. The woman would think she was being told to quit, and the man would think he's doing great. Yeah. And so they've realized, oh, maybe we need to think about the way we give out feedback. Maybe it needs to be more nuanced than it is. And so I think there are a lot, but again, the men we have have talked to are incredibly open to this, that everybody wants to learn.
And that might be the woman going into that review, the same review, identical reviews, she will hear the criticism. There'll be, no one's going to get a 100% perfect review, right? Then you'd be God. So she goes into the review, she hears this one line, she comes away thinking, oh my God, he said, you know, and forgets all the good stuff, but hears that one line of, you need to improve on, and she starts thinking, oh, I need to go and find a new job.
But think of how much more powerful it is for a management group to have representative voices, men and women, because then you can talk through and understand these issues a lot sooner than an aha that happens after the same review is presented to two folks of different genders. So it's axiomatic.
And have you seen that in your career, Eileen, with different management teams and what happens when there's more diversity?
Yes. Yes, I see it. I see it today. Running Google in the UK, there was not a precedent. I'm the first woman to do so, and there's a different tempo that's welcome. It's very welcome by the women, but it seems it's welcome by the men. So, and we're seeing good output and good productivity at the same time. So there's no slip in performance, and lest anyone doubt, if you're a woman in leadership, you have to deliver on the goods. So the performance is expected. The manner by which a woman might lead and engage and be inclusive and collaborate differs somewhat, and it can often make for a very, very good culture.
I think that's important, isn't it, Eileen, for women to realize that there's a bottom line of quality that is expected of every employee, whether they're a man or a woman. What we have found is generally women bring that bottom line to the table already. We tend to be very good at what we do. We're efficient, we're effective. But I think that some of the qualities which women can have that perhaps men find harder to have, for a long time we've denigrated as soft skills. Now we're starting to see those as profitable skills. And it's worth us remembering that, because otherwise we do start trying to act like, you know, we're old enough to remember the time when we wore hideous shoulder pads and terrible string ties, and it was a bad look. I mean, it was just not good. When we try and behave like men, we know from all of the work that's been done, it doesn't work for us.
And this goes to a very important point as well, because when we think about traditional masculine styles of leading, for example, the research shows us that men, bad news, tend to overestimate competence. Their actual ability to deliver on something.
Right.
So, are there some things that men can learn from traditionally female approaches, or you know, where the research has highlighted relational skills or collaboration? We're certainly living in a world that puts a premium on collaboration, on innovation, on creativity.
Well, and I think that is the key, isn't it? Which is that all of the measures you talk about in terms of why women make a difference, they're measuring diversity of thought and management style. That's not just somebody wearing a skirt into the office and sitting on a corporate board that makes a difference. The reason why diversity works is you're bringing together different styles of managing and thinking. And what we have found, especially in the last 6 months as we've been talking to so many different organizations and groups, is that another thing that has to happen, of course, is that the definition of what a leader looks like ultimately must change.
Yes.
Because although everybody understands this, we understand the data, we know it, the PwC knows it as more than most companies, but the fact is you need to have leadership at the top that says, you know what, I am going to value confident listening and analysis, and I'm going to make that plain to everybody at the company. And that will allow for a broader definition of leadership and more women at the top.
And one thing I think we should say is, look, we're not suggesting to women that there's a different type of confidence for women which is shy and retiring. Mm-hmm. You have to make your voice heard. You have to make your voice heard because your organization is better off if you do. Your employers are employing you and paying you a salary to get your voice out there. You can do it, however, in a way that is comfortable to you. I think when women try to put on that male armor and that bravado and that swagger, if they don't necessarily feel it, they just don't feel confident either. This is not an excuse for apologizing for your opinions, for not sitting at the table, for not raising your hand in that meeting, for not going for that promotion. You have to do all of those things, recognizing that you have to do them because everybody will be better off if you do.
Thank you. So as we prepare to wrap up our webcast, we want to end again with maybe a summary of some specific ideas and actions that we can all apply in our lives to build our confidence. And I actually want to start with Chemka, who has flown here from Denver to be with us here in London. And Chemka, maybe you could stand up, and I think we've got a microphone, and you could share with us, or we can just give you this one right here. There we go. And if you could share with us one piece of advice. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So I just want to give a little bit of a small story. Just like Mike mentioned, I came to the US when I was about 16 years old, and I started 10th grade in high school. And to this day, I still remember the first day of going to school and feeling nervous and being anxious because I didn't know anyone and I didn't speak a single word of English. So it was the scariest day of my life. But I was able to push myself and not push myself to get out of my comfort zone, and that made me more determined and more confident. So I would tell people to not be afraid of taking risks and don't be afraid of doing new things, trying new things. That's how you will learn. Don't be afraid of failing as well.
Thank you, Chemka.
Thank you.
Eileen?
Well, I spent probably 25 years in different business-related enterprises and started as a journalist and then migrated over to media, which now in Google is in some form a media company. I could say that some of my success has stemmed from being willing to take on really hard problems and solve them. Things that others shied away from, things that didn't have a clear outcome, things that had uncertain potential. One of them at Google for me was YouTube. We bought YouTube in 2006, and sometime in mid-2007, an executive said to me, "Here, Eileen, take this and figure out how to make some money on it." And it was really that informal. And it was well before YouTube became, or the phenomenon it is, which is the world's largest platform for the creating and sharing of video, and a platform that really can change outcomes for the world, political outcomes. It's just an enormous phenomenon. But at the time, it was quite uncertain what we would do and how we would make any sense of a business enterprise. And it was unpopular. The safest thing would have been to stay and run the business I was running. But taking that risk and being willing to say, I don't know exactly how we're going to do this, but we'll figure it out. And I felt confident we would figure it out. Probably set me on a completely different trajectory in the long run in my career at Google. So solving hard problems, being willing to sign up even when the outcome is not perfectly crystalline, and then recruiting great people along the way to work on your team and believe in the value of the mission you're on.
Thank you, Eileen.
We've talked a lot about the concrete steps that you can take to grow your confidence, but I wanted to leave you with one piece of research we came up with for our book that I think demonstrates why confidence is so important for women, and particularly for young women. This comes from a professor called Cameron Anderson. He's in Berkeley, California. And he has done work looking at the relative importance of competence and confidence when it comes to success. And the work he has done over the past few years pretty clearly demonstrates that when it comes to success, confidence matters as much as, if not more than, competence. And I think for women, this is a slightly terrifying prospect. We are all about competence, and we have a lot of it. But what this research that was almost so depressing that we didn't want to use it in our book left Claire and I thinking was that this is a great lesson for women, that we need to expand our definition of talent. Women, and young women in particular, need to realize that confidence is part of talent. And you just have to face it, have it, grow it, if you really want to get as far as you can.
Thank you.
I think I will leave you with a thought I got from my daughter, who's 9 and quite a rebel and full of interesting ideas. And she's helped me learn a lot about confidence, actually. But I was encouraging her a year ago to make sure she was raising her hand in the classroom, right? And this became a theme in our house. Are you speaking up? Are you saying anything? And at one point, she turned to me exasperated, and she came home and she said, "Yes, Mom, I'm raising my hand all the time, even when I don't have anything to say." And I thought, that is actually what women need to do. And it's funny because we got into a back and forth with our psychologist who really helped us on the book, Dr. Richard Petty, and he said, well, is that a good idea to really raise your hand if you have nothing to say? Maybe that would lead to catastrophic consequences. And I said, I think what it is for women and girls, we do have something to say. We are not recognizing, in fact, that we tend to think we don't. We do. So I would say raise your hands metaphorically and challenge yourselves to do that even when you think you don't have anything to say.
Thank you, Claire. And I'll conclude as well with one action and one request. And I'll speak to men now. And I'm asking all the men who are participating today within PwC and universities, as students, colleagues, clients, to join with us. Let's come together and ask ourselves, are we he for she? Let's stand up and make our voices heard. Let's go to he for she and demonstrate our public commitment at their site. But more than that, let's engage the women in our lives. Let's listen. And let's make our own voices heard for inclusion. We started today with that very powerful word, confidence. And we know it has a very disproportionate impact in all of our lives, whether we can fulfill our own potential as students, as colleagues, as professionals. We're hoping that today all of you leave this webcast with at least one idea, one action you're going to commit yourselves to. Share it with others, and consider how you can also build the confidence of others. We've got lots more information. You can go to our site at pwc.com/aspire. Please do. There are tools available there. Go to he for she. Big Think has partnered with us on this venture, and we've got some great content at Big Think. And of course, we continue our support of leanin.org. So on behalf of all of the PwC partners and colleagues around our global network, my colleagues at Strategy and, I know they're joining us in great numbers as well. On behalf of all of my colleagues, I want to thank you for joining us, and we especially want to thank our spectacular hosts here in London for hosting this wonderful event, and we've had a great day together here in London. Thank you.